All right, deep divers, ready for another plunge into the depths of, well, kind of weird stuff.
Always up for a challenge. What are we diving into today?
Today's deep dive is all about the Antichrist.
Oh, getting right into it. I like it.
And more specifically, where will this figure come from? Based on, certain interpretations of biblical prophecy, of course.
Prophecies. Always fascinating and, let's be honest, a little bit unnerving.
Right. Especially when people start connecting them to current events.
Which it sounds like is exactly where we're headed.
You know it.
Yeah.
We're exploring this video transcript, and it's packed with stuff about the books of Daniel and Revelation.
Those are pretty dense books, even for folks who are familiar with the Bible.
No kidding. But what hooked me on this source is that they actually connect these prophecies to a specific date.
A date. Okay, now you've got my attention. That's pretty bold.
And the location, too. They're talking about the rise of a new Babylon in a very specific part of the world.
A new Babylon. Now that's interesting. Always a lot of symbolism associated with that name.
Exactly. But before we get into their whole theory, maybe we should define some terms first. Like, what are we even talking about when we say Antichrist?
Yeah, good point. That term gets thrown around a lot, and I think it means different things to different people.
So how is it used in this source?
Well, they seem to be open to a couple of interpretations. On one hand, they talk about the Antichrist as an actual person.
Like an evil world leader kind of figure.
Yeah, someone who embodies like the ultimate opposition to, to goodness and to the teachings of Christ.
Okay, so that's one possibility, an individual Antichrist. But they also mention another interpretation, right?
Right. They also talk about the Antichrist as more of a system or an ideology.
So not a single person, but like a whole way of thinking, a way of life that goes against those, Christian values.
Yeah, exactly. Something that opposes those ideas on a much broader, maybe more insidious level.
Okay, that makes sense. So it could be a person, but it could also be this pervasive anti-Christian force in the world.
That's how they seem to be using it, yeah. And it's interesting because it allows for a lot more flexibility in terms of how this prophecy might, play out in the real world.
So it's not necessarily about a guy with horns and a pitchfork. It's more about recognizing the forces that are working against, well, whatever you consider to be good, I guess.
That's a pretty good summary, yeah.
Cool. Okay, so Antichrist, check. But what about Babylon? We need to define that too, right?
Absolutely. Babylon is another one of those terms that's loaded with symbolic meaning.
So are we talking about an actual city here? Are we dusting off our maps?
Not quite. In the Bible, Babylon is often used as a symbol of, well, kind of everything that's opposed to God.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Think worldly power, materialism, oppression, kind of a rejection of spiritual values in favor of, earthly pursuits.
So more of a representation of a way of life or a mindset than an actual location?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's not so much about a place on a map as it is about a system of values, a way of being in the world that's opposed to, well, to a more righteous way of living, I guess.
Okay, so we're not hunting for a literal city named Babylon. We're looking for something more abstract.
Exactly. And that's important because it means that this Babylon could manifest in different ways in different places.
Makes sense. So we've got Antichrist figured out and Babylon check and check. There's one more term they use that's kind of throwing me off, though.
Oh, yeah. Which one is that?
7 times. What does that even mean in this context? I'm picturing a week-long sale at the supermarket or something.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. In biblical prophecy, time is often, it's often symbolic. And 7 times is one of those time periods that pops up in the book of Daniel.
So they're not talking about 7 literal days.
Not necessarily. This source uses what's called the day-year principle. Basically, they interpret each day in the prophecy as representing a year.
Ah, okay. So 7 times doesn't mean a week, it means 7 years.
Yep. Or it could even represent a much longer period, depending on how they're applying that day-year principle.
So we're dealing with some serious biblical math here.
You could say that. And they actually use this principle to calculate a specific date for when all this new Babylon stuff supposedly kicks off.
They have a date, like a day on the calendar. Come on, you've got to give me the date.
October 1st, 1982.
1982. That's pretty recent, all things considered. Did a giant neon sign labeled Babylon suddenly appear somewhere? What happened on that date?
Well, it's not quite that straightforward. But the source argues that something very significant did happen on that day.
Okay, I'm dying to know. Spill it.
Helmut Kohl, became Chancellor of West Germany on October 1st, 1982.
Helmut Kohl. That name definitely rings a bell. Big figure in German history for sure. But what does he have to do with the Antichrist or, any of this Babylon business?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what this source dives into next. They lay out some pretty specific arguments connecting Kohl's rise to power with this whole prophetic scenario.
Well, I am officially intrigued. Guess we'll have to dive deeper to find out more, huh?
That's what we do here. Ready to keep going.
Absolutely. Listeners, join us as we unpack this theory and explore how Helmut Kohl might just be connected to the Antichrist and the prophecy of a new Babylon. Back again for more deep diving. Last time, things got, a little prophetically intense. We're trying to figure out how this source connects Helmut Kohl to the Antichrist and a new Babylon.
It's quite the puzzle, isn't it?
Totally. So remind me, how did Kohl even become chancellor in the first place? I feel like there was something unusual about it.
You're right. It wasn't a typical election victory. The source really emphasizes that Kohl came to power through what's called a constructive vote of no confidence.
Whoa, that sounds kind of dramatic, like a political thriller or something. What does that even mean?
It's basically a way to replace a chancellor without a general election.
So kind of a shakeup from within the existing government.
Yeah, exactly. The parliament votes to remove the current chancellor and replace them with someone else, all in one go.
Okay, I can see how that would fit into this whole prophecy thing. It wasn't a planned transition. It was more like, boom, sudden change of leadership.
That's exactly how the source interprets it. It wasn't a scheduled election. It was this unexpected shift in power.
Almost like, fate stepping in or something.
That's the vibe they're going for, yeah.
Right.
Like it was all part of some grand plan,
Makes sense. But they don't just start with that, right? They actually give specific evidence to support their claim that Kohl is connected to this new Babylon.
They do. They lay out three main points that they believe, strengthen their argument.
Okay, let's hear it. Hit me with their evidence. What's their first point?
First, they point out that German reunification happened exactly 8 years after Kohl became chancellor.
8 years.
To the day. Kohl took office on October 1st, 1982. German reunification happened on October 3rd, 1990.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty crazy coincidence, I gotta admit.
And it's more than just the date itself. They point out that October 3rd corresponds to the 14th day of Tishrei on the Hebrew calendar.
Okay, so now we're bringing the Hebrew calendar into this.
Yep. And according to their calculations, the 14th of Tishrei was also the date that ancient Babylon fell.
Whoa, hold on. So they're saying that ancient Babylon fell on the same day, according to the Hebrew calendar, that Germany was reunified under Helmut Kohl.
That's what they're claiming, yeah.
My mind is officially blown. I mean, that's a lot of layers of history and prophecy all lining up.
Right. It's like they're trying to show that there's this hidden pattern in history, this cyclical thing where empires rise and fall, and maybe we're seeing a repeat of that ancient pattern with Germany and this new Babylon.
Okay, that's a lot to process. Yeah. But okay, I'm trying to keep up. What's their second piece of evidence?
Their next point focuses on Kohl's role in establishing the European Union.
Ah, the EU. Okay, so how does that fit in?
Well, Kohl was really instrumental in shaping the Maastricht Treaty, which is basically the agreement that created the EU as we know it today.
Yeah, that was a huge deal. It led to the euro currency, more political cooperation, all that stuff. So are they saying that the EU itself is this new Babylon?
Kind of, yeah. They connect it to those images in the book of Revelation about, the woman riding the beast and all that.
I've always found those Revelation images a bit creepy, honestly.
Oh, yeah. They're definitely intense. But what's interesting is that the source actually points out a connection to a specific image, the depiction of Europa riding a bull, which you see on some of the euro coins.
Wait, seriously, Europa riding a bull? That's on actual money.
Yep. And they argue that it's like a subtle nod to those prophetic images in Revelation, like a subconscious link between the EU and this whole idea of a new Babylon.
Whoa, my mind is officially blown again.
I know, right? It's a lot to take in.
It is. All right, give me the third piece of evidence. What's their final point connecting Kohl to all of this?
Well, their final point is about Germany's current position in Europe.
Okay, so what about it?
They argue that, Germany has basically become the dominant power within the EU.
Economically, for sure.
And politically, too. to a large extent. And they connect that back to this idea of a new Babylon rising from the ashes of the old.
So they're basically saying that modern Germany, as the heart of the EU, is this new Babylon that the prophecies were talking about all along.
That's their argument in a nutshell, yeah. They see it as a continuation of that historical pattern we talked about earlier, with empires rising and falling in that region of the world, from Babylon to Greece to Rome and now potentially to a German-led Babylon in the form of the EU.
It's a bold theory for sure, but hold on, they're not actually saying that Cole himself was the Antichrist, are they?
No, they make a clear distinction there. Cole passed away in 2017, so he obviously can't be the Antichrist figure they're talking about.
Okay, that makes sense. So who are they talking about then? If Cole wasn't the Antichrist, who do they think it will be?
They don't actually name a specific person, but they do warn that the Antichrist, or the beast, as they often call him, will emerge from within this new Babylon.
So they're leaving it open-ended, but implying that this future leader, this beast, is going to come from within the EU.
And probably with strong ties to Germany, given everything they've said about coal and German reunification and all that.
Right. Okay, I'm following. It's definitely a lot to think about. But what I find interesting is that they don't seem to be trying to scare people with all this. They're not shouting, "The end is near," or anything like that.
Yeah, that's true. They actually end their whole presentation with a call for discernment and personal study of the Bible.
Like, they're not saying, "Take our word for it, this is how it's going to go down." They're encouraging people to, think for themselves.
Exactly. They specifically caution against just blindly accepting any one interpretation, They really emphasize the importance of critical thinking and personal study.
I appreciate that. It's refreshing to see someone presenting this kind of intense stuff without resorting to fear-mongering or trying to, control people's beliefs.
It's a much more respectful approach, I think. They're basically saying, here's our interpretation, but don't just take our word for it. Go read the Bible yourself. Study history, think about it critically, and come to your own conclusions.
I like that a lot. It's a good reminder that we should always be, questioning and double-checking the information we come across, especially when it comes to stuff like this.
Right. It's so easy to get swept up in a particular narrative or interpretation, especially when it's presented with a lot of conviction.
Totally. But they're reminding us to, step back, think for ourselves, and not just accept things at face value.
Which is a skill that's becoming more and more important these days, with all the information overload and conflicting narratives out there.
Couldn't agree more. Now, there's one thing they mentioned that I'm curious about. They kind of throw out these hints about other countries like the U.S., Russia, China, Israel, and suggest that they've got roles to play in this whole end time scenario, too.
They do touch on that, yeah.
But they don't really elaborate, do they?
Unfortunately, no. They acknowledge that it's a global scenario with multiple players, but they don't go into detail about the specific roles those other nations might have.
So they're kind of teasing us with those ideas, but not giving us the full picture.
Yeah, it's like they're dropping breadcrumbs, but not giving us the whole loaf of bread, yeah.
It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? What do they see happening on the world stage? How do these different countries fit into this prophetic puzzle they've laid out?
It definitely leaves you with a lot of questions and maybe even a little bit of nervous curiosity about what they might think is coming.
For sure. Well, folks, we've explored this source's take on biblical prophecy, their arguments about Helmut Kohl, and the emergence of a new Babylon. Whether you buy into their interpretation or not, it's definitely made us think about history, power, and, maybe even the future in a whole new way.
And it's all a good reminder that ideas, especially ideas that tap into our deepest beliefs and fears, can be incredibly powerful things.
Right. Even if you don't believe in the whole end times prophecy thing, you can't deny that those ideas have shaped history and continue to influence how people see the world.
Absolutely. And it's up to each of us to engage with those ideas thoughtfully and critically so we can navigate this complex world with a bit more understanding and maybe even a little bit of wisdom.
Well said. Stick around, folks, because we're going to wrap up this deep dive by considering some of the bigger implications of the source's interpretation. Who knows, you might even pick up some fun facts to impress your friends at your next dinner party. Welcome back, Deep Divers. We've been on quite a journey with this source material, haven't we? Exploring prophecies, deciphering symbols, and connecting some pretty unexpected dots.
It's been a fascinating exploration, to say the least.
I keep coming back to something the source emphasizes, this whole idea of discernment. They really push viewers to think critically about these prophecies, not just accept everything at face value.
Absolutely. They even go so far as to encourage viewers to, like, double-check their scriptural references and historical facts.
It's like they're saying, don't just take our word for it, do your own homework, which, honestly, I really respect.
Yeah, it shows that they're not trying to, to force their interpretation on anyone. They're presenting their argument, but also acknowledging that there are other perspectives and interpretations out there.
It's a much more open-minded approach than I was expecting, honestly.
It's refreshing, especially when dealing with topics that can be so, well, so divisive and emotionally charged.
Absolutely. It's like they're saying, hey, this is what we see in these prophecies, but ultimately it's up to you to decide what you believe.
And they emphasize the importance of personal study and critical thinking, which is never a bad thing.
Never a bad thing, especially these days with so much information flying around and everyone claiming to have the absolute truth.
Right. It's more important than ever to be able to filter through all that noise, evaluate information critically, and come to our own conclusions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the source really highlights the power of ideas, especially ideas that are rooted in, in things like religion and history.
Those are powerful forces, for sure. They shape how we see the world, how we understand our place in it, and even, how we act.
Exactly. And even if you don't agree with their specific interpretation, I think this source challenges us to think about the potential impact of these ancient prophecies on, on our modern world.
Like, are these prophecies just stories from the past? Or do they contain insights that are still relevant today?
Right. And how might our understanding of those prophecies influence the decisions we make, individually and collectively?
Big questions. Well, listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, maybe even sparked some lively debates with your friends and family.
Because ultimately, that's what we're all about here, exploring these fascinating, sometimes perplexing topics, and encouraging you to think deeply about the world around you.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep with us.
Until next time.
See you on the next deep dive.